All right, Emily, what are we talking about today?
How to balance the decision between holding out for the perfect job and simply getting a job, financial planning and unconventional relationships, and filial responsibility.
Welcome to the Science of Wealth, where we discuss the science behind financial planning and the art of learning and applying it. Okay, so from your questions, I am to take it that you are looking for a new job potentially and starting to tax plan for a thruple, and you're worried about your parents. Am I tracking correctly here?
Some of it, but not all of it. The good news for you is I'm not looking for a new job.
Well, I will consider that a plus.
Although it does stem from a conversation we had with a client recently and have had several times in the past with other people. They come in and they've either been laid off or they quit or whatever. They're between jobs and they're trying to balance the whole, focusing on getting the job they want, applying, waiting for the perfect fit versus taking a temporary job until they find that perfect job. What's the best use of their time and energy?
Sure. So I think first and foremost, it's going to depend on the nature of why they're looking for a job or why they're out of work. So first things first, if you have been laid off or let go because of a company change where you're eligible for unemployment, then it's going to make a lot more sense for you to take your time in the unemployment position and in the job search, because your unemployment is derived, or your benefit is derived at least in part, from what your prior earnings were, and you are not necessarily required to take a job below a certain threshold of your earnings to then be taken off of unemployment. So essentially, if you were working and making six figures, you are not required to run out and get a job as a grocery bagger at a supermart or something, because that's an available job. It's not replacing your income adequately, and your unemployment benefits are probably greater than you would make doing that job. On the other hand, if you were previously a grocery clerk and you get laid off as a grocery clerk, you are probably going to need to just go ahead and get that job again or work at a Starbucks or something, because it's approximately the same earnings and the available opportunities are plethora. On the other hand, if you've been fired, right, or let go for cause or something like that where there is no severance and you're not eligible for unemployment, then the necessity of making an income kicks in if you don't have an adequate emergency fund to help you float for a while. So I think that's the first thing to consider.
All right, that makes sense. What do you recommend for an adequate emergency fund for people?
Circumstantially, this is going to depend. So, a couple of variables that go into this. First and foremost, are you single or married? Second of all, do you and your spouse work if you are married, or does only one of you work? So, functionally, I tend to look at this as, for any individual, I'd like to see them have 3 to 6 months of emergency savings in place. And there's a question of what emergency savings means. Is that your full quality of life for 3 to 6 months, or is that just bare necessities for 3 to 6 months? Because that can be a pretty big difference in terms of what 3 to 6 months actually means. And then if you are married, I'm typically going to be okay with something like 3 months per spouse. Meaning, if we're relatively equal earners, we can probably get by with 3 months. But if one of us earns 200 a year and one of us earns 60 a year, then there's a pretty substantial difference there. So we need to sort of balance out the risk level of disparate incomes. But if we're back to only one working spouse and one stay at home spouse or non working spouse, then typically I'm going to want to see that get closer to 6 months, just because at the end of the day, 3 months seems like a long time, but that will go by in a hurry. And though some jobs hire very quickly and pay out very quickly, right, particularly low barrier to entry level or unskilled jobs, if you are trying to replace a high skill income, unless it's in extremely high demand and it's highly undersupplied in its labor market, it could take just weeks to get an interview, months to get through an interview process. So you might start a hiring process or a recruiting process on day 5 of unemployment, and it could easily take out to day 45, day 60, day 90 just to actually start the job and get paid.
Mm. All right. Well, during that time, when you're looking at jobs, how do you compare which one you're going to take? I mean, there's the obvious thing of salary and like monetary benefits that are pretty easy to compare, but there's a lot of things like working from home versus going into the office, or what their vacation policy is, or their work life balance, whatever, which doesn't really have a dollar worth, I guess, but it's certainly important.
Well, I think this is something that kind of lends itself to the opposite side of a coin that I talk to business owners about. I typically try to advise business owners that people are going to work for you for one of three reasons: compensation, convenience, or mission. Right. So, compensation is the pay adequate or high? Are the rewards, the monetary benefits, and so on strong? So, for example, somebody with unlimited earning potential in a sales job might find that rewarding. Somebody making more money might be a reason to change positions and leave their existing job to join your company and so on. So just, is the pay good is sort of a baseline expectation. Plenty of people are making not necessarily what many people would consider great pay, but they're making good enough pay to put up with a job that they otherwise would not do, or the pay not adequate to put up with it. The other version is sort of what you described in terms of hybrid work or remote work or flexibility, which is just convenience, right? Does this kind of fit my overall lifestyle needs? So, for example, if I'm a single parent, a job that gives me a lot of flexibility about when I start, when I stop, coming and going from work, etc., that might outweigh a pure compensation opportunity, simply because I need the flexibility to take my kids to daycare or to school, to pick them up, take them to appointments, right? Just as part of the caretaking role as a single parent that money may not be able to replace. And that same sort of calculus comes in for married couples where, if we have one child and we're both working, it probably makes sense to keep working and just pay for a daycare or a sitter. But if we have two children, three children, four children who are at an age where they can't be in school, then the cost of daycare may begin to exceed my earning potential or get close to break even with my earning potential, where now it just makes sense both monetarily and from a personal quality of life standpoint for one of us to be a stay-at-home parent. So convenience can take a lot of kind of flavors and colors and kind of definitions on an individualized basis. But at the end of the day, it's about, does the job fit my lifestyle needs or expectations? Mission is the hardest one. Mission is, we're going to save the world. So this is why a lot of people work for nonprofits or work for certain governmental organizations. For example, nobody joins the military for the pay. The college benefits and whatnot are nice, but probably not nice enough to potentially die for. So fundamentally, a lot of people who join the military do it to serve their country or because they want to make a difference in the world. A lot of people work for small community nonprofit organizations with lower than average pay or lower than average benefits because they'd rather make an impact on their community in that way than work for a for-profit institution. And then there are some for-profit institutions that are just changing the world, right? To work for a company that's on the cutting edge of its field or of its industry can be very exciting and very compelling. So at the end of the day, when we're comparing job opportunities, it's all has to funnel back to, what do I need, right? Which is compensation adequate to stay alive, right? To survive and ideally to thrive, but not necessarily. Does it have a culture that fits and a compensation and sort of a quality of life that fits my needs as an individual, my family dynamic, my living situation, and so on? And then, barring those two things, does it have a mission that I can get behind, to be passionate about, to be willing to make sacrifices on the other things? Or does it have a mission that I can get behind and that's just icing on the cake because the compensation and the culture and so on are good enough as it is?
Hmm. That is a lot to consider as you're job hunting.
Well, and nobody said it was sort of fair to do the calculus. I think in terms of a layoff situation or an unemployment situation, the biggest mistake I see people make here is holding out for something that is just not plausible, particularly if they have non-transferable skills. So I'll use somebody that I won't name here as an example. They have been much more successful in their career than I ever would have expected them to be. They came into a position entry level. They were making $11 an hour, and they've really worked themselves up to quite a position in their company over the course of a little more than a decade. But they don't have a formal education. The skill set they have with that company is only slightly transferable. Like, they have sort of the discipline and skills, but there's a lot of tribal knowledge from their particular institution, where I don't know that if they were laid off or fired, that they could go to another company in the same role and make the same money, or be able to demand the same level of compensation and benefits that they have at their current company, simply because a lot of their knowledge and skills are not transferable. And And so, in their type of situation, though they're currently making a very decent living doing what they do, on the other side of that, I don't know that I could see them getting into a position where they could simply, quit their job, get laid off, whatever, and just go replace their income. I think they would be put in a position to take a pretty big step back in compensation if they had to work somewhere else. And at best, they could hope for mission or that cultural convenience consideration.
In those situations, you just recommend they do everything they can to stay at that company, or go the other way and try to diversify their skills while they're there in case they do need to move or they get laid off or something.
Certainly the latter. I think something that people trick themselves into thinking is that just because I have a paycheck that shows up every other week or twice a month or whatever it is, that they have safety. But the reality is, particularly in certain industries, layoffs happen all the time, downsizing happens all the time. Performance mistakes can happen where even though you're a good employee, you make one mistake that's just too big to ignore and you get let go. I think it's very dangerous for people to look at their employer singularly as the only place they can work and to build their career and skill set around that specific employer. I can use you as an example. Here at this firm, you have been developing to become a wealth planner and been building a skill set and gaining knowledge and experience and so on to do so. But on the other side of that, right, that's transferable. You could go work for another firm with the experience you have and command the compensation you have today and the career potential that you have here somewhere else if necessary. Whereas, if you work in, let's say, a proprietary software at a big institutional company where they've created their own homebrewed logistics system or IT software system or something like that, where that technology isn't used anywhere but that company, then it's very problematic to have built your entire career development around that specific technology or system that only works there because if that company goes under, if you get laid off, if you get fired, whatever the case is, it's just not transferable.
Sure. Okay. Well, I have another question now. Okay. So I'm thinking about unconventional relationships, as we talked about earlier. And, for a couple where there's just two people, retirement planning and beneficiaries and things like that are pretty clearly laid out, especially if they're legally married, that comes with all these rights and privileges. But in the example of, say, a throuple, like you'd mentioned, that third person that maybe isn't legally married, what about them? Is there a way to protect them? I mean, they're not going to have all the same options as two that are like legally married.
So, yes and no. Let's start with the no because it's going to be sort of the most obvious. From a legal standpoint, at least here in the United States, we essentially do not recognize non monogamous relationships. So, polyamory is not illegal, but polygamy is. Bigamy, which is getting married to somebody else while you're already married, or sort of a backdoor version of polygamy, is also illegal essentially everywhere. And most of the rights and privileges somebody accrues by being in a relationship come through marriage, whether it's a formally recognized marriage or common law marriage, or with a slight step down, a domestic partnership. But you can't, let's say, be in a domestic partnership with 6 different people or 3 different people, or you can't be formally married to one person and then common law married to another person. And so, pretty much almost universally, the tax benefits and rights and privileges, the healthcare rights and benefits and privileges, the legal benefits and privileges tend to accrue to married couples specifically. So when we think about that third person, they're going to get left out of things like health insurance. They're going to get left out of things like a marital benefit to being married when you file your taxes. They are not going to enjoy by default the same legal rights and privileges to make healthcare decisions for their spouse or to inherit their assets without potentially incurring estate taxes, those sorts of things. So that's sort of the no. If we think about the yes is largely going to do with deliberately delegating certain legal privileges to another individual in the same way you might delegate a legal privilege to your children or to your sibling, your brother, your sister, or to a very close friend. So examples of this might be providing powers of attorney to this individual for things like financial decisions, or power of attorney for healthcare decisions, empowering them to serve as a trustee or as a executor for a trust or your estate, making them a beneficiary for certain investment accounts or financial assets, or making them a beneficiary of a trust that you have. So there's nothing that says you can't empower somebody else with certain rights and privileges. There's nothing that says you can't leave assets to this other individual or provide them with certain rights and authorities over you. But I think the fundamental barrier here is this third person, or these additional people, as your dynamic might be, is typically not going to enjoy the same benefits that any monogamous married couple is going to, because our laws just generally don't seem to recognize that.
So you can address certain elements of it, but it's never going to be quite as simple.
Not quite as simple. And again, also state by state, locality by locality, what is or isn't permitted could vary. This is where you certainly want to talk to a skilled estate attorney, a skilled family law attorney, and so on. But then just, there's also still a societal bias against it. I'm not saying it's good, bad, or otherwise to be in a non-conventional relationship, but simply put, our laws today don't recognize those in any significant sense. And so there are certain de facto rights and privileges that typically apply to married couples that simply are not going to apply to an unmarried relationship.
Hmm. I guess that answers that question, but it isn't always the best answer.
Well, and I mean, if we want to try to play, I don't want to say devil's advocate here, but just understand why, beyond certain societal, social mores or religious norms or anything like that, there is a world in which if you gave substantial license to people to have greater tax benefits or legal privileges to more than one individual, that you could see weird sort of, I'll say, family relationship gamification in the same way that we see in businesses with subsidiary companies and sister companies and offshoots and so on. So I'm not saying that it's not largely just social or values driven or religiously driven in the United States about why we do or don't permit these things, but there is potentially a just basic, legal regulation, tax regulation, et cetera, reason to not permit more complex relationships. That is a whole separate conversation or argument you could have with your congressperson about why you should or shouldn't. But there is at least some internal logic to limiting the potential permissions to singular relationships.
I guess that makes a lot more sense, unfortunately. Okay, I have a third and final question for today. This is
All right.
about filial responsibility. You had talked about that back when I started here because I didn't know a lot about it. For me personally, each of my parents live in a separate state from each other. So I had to look that up. But before we get into it, maybe we should go over exactly what filial responsibility is.
Filial responsibility is sort of the inversion of a parent's responsibility for their children. So, when you are a child, when you are under the age of 18, right, your parents are legally responsible for you. They have to feed you, clothe you, take care of you, make sure you go to school, and they are liable for things you do, right? If you are driving your parents' car when you're 16, you get into a wreck, your parents are on the hook for the damages and so on. By extension or by inversion of that, filial responsibility is a child's responsibility for the upkeep, maintenance, and welfare of their parents or their family members. So, in certain states, if something like a parent goes into long-term care under Medicaid, in some states, you as a child may be responsible for paying their bills or paying back the bills that they incur should the state enter into their care. Now, this is not super common in practice. It's somewhat not typical to see states go after children, but the place where this often kicks in is there is such a thing as Medicaid planning, or long-term care planning around Medicaid, in which families do deliberately spend assets, donate assets, gift assets over years to essentially make a parent or parents poor on paper, while transferring the wealth of the parents to the family or charities or trusts, so that then, when they do need long-term care, the state will have to pay for it. But some states have what we call filial responsibility laws, which cover a variety of responsibilities. But in this particular instance, as might apply to many listeners, The idea here is, hey, if the state feels that it should go after you to pay some of this stuff back, they can go after your kids or beneficiaries to claim assets or try to claw back gifts, or simply just send them a bill for the costs incurred by their parents, because the state views it as the obligation of the family to care for the family member first.
So it's not just your parents, it can be grandparents or someone else you're related to.
Functionally, it's really kind of any close family member that it can apply to, but that really gets into the state by state dynamics. Every state defines who is eligible or ineligible or responsible differently. So that's certainly, again, kind of a topic for a qualified estate attorney or family law attorney to dig into on a person by person, state by state basis. But I think from a planning standpoint, it's something to be aware of. In Colorado, we don't have a filial responsibility law that I'm aware of, but there are plenty of other states that do, and the question can arise, hey, does it trigger based on where the parent lives? Does it trigger based on where the kid lives? Does it trigger based on whether either of them lives in one place or another, or both have to? How does the quality of the relationship, like estranged parents versus legally actually separated parents or so on, apply? So there's a lot of nuance here, but I think it's a planning risk. A question we like to ask our clients early on in the process is there anybody that you're financially responsible for outside of your household, parents, siblings, or anybody that we're worried about becoming responsible for? And I'd say probably half the people we talk to will say, my parents have passed on, but his parents or her parents are in a tough spot, or my dad is okay, but my mom is not okay, and we've had a lot of conversations about whether she might come to live with us at some point. So it's a matter not only of planning for yourself, your own care, funding your potential healthcare needs or personal costs and expenses later on in life, but it's also recognizing that your parents or your close family members' lack of responsibility or lack of means in those circumstances could come back to bite you based on where you live, where they live, or just what has led to that situation.
When planning for that, is it better to just save money and kind of anticipate having to pay for that depending on the laws? Or is it better to sometimes get long term care insurance for this person if that's something you're able to do?
That's trickier. From a risk management standpoint, long-term care insurance should be held by a lot more people than it is, but it's expensive. It can be hard to qualify for, and that leads a lot of people to forego it. But pretty much every state has what's called a partnership provision, in which the family's assets are sheltered in an amount equal to the amount of long-term care insurance that's purchased, so that there's also an incentive from a inheritance wealth building standpoint to buy the insurance to shield assets. That said, from that standpoint, how do you plan for it? I mean, first and foremost, the best person to plan for it is the person who needs the care themselves, right? I think past the age of 50, before the age of 60, is a really good time to look into getting traditional long-term care insurance. If you don't qualify for it during underwriting, or you can't afford it as it is, there are other versions like asset-based life insurance policies, where you essentially give the insurance company a lump sum like $50,000, and then they promise to pay for several $100,000 of care in the future if it's needed. There's other versions like annuity products where they can have long-term care riders where they will significantly increase their payout if you enter into a long-term care facility. Uh, there's all sorts of planning mechanisms there that individuals can use for their own protection. For kids looking at their parents and worrying that that might be a situation that they have to deal with, first and foremost, the biggest piece of advice I can give here is have a conversation with your parents. Money can be an emotionally loaded, difficult topic for anybody to have a conversation about. Some families it's easy, some families it's more difficult, but at the end of the day, you need to know where your parents stand, right? If you are a legal adult, even if you're just in your early 20s, your late 20s, your parents are still working, whatever the situation is, you do need to have a better understanding of your parents' finances. That doesn't mean they need to tell you everything, but what you do not want to be is blindsided by a bill from the state, or blindsided by a sudden ask from your parents, hey, I need to move in with you, or hey, you need to help pay my rent, because they have not prepared adequately. And so, like all forms of planning, an ounce of prevention is a pound of cure. You want to figure out what the potential risk and need is there early on, so that you can help head it off, whether there's a filial responsibility or not. If there is, you definitely want to prepare. If there's not, that's fine. You just need to be able to, accept that there may still be some burdens placed upon you by your family, not by the state.
Sure. If you're getting long term care insurance, do those policies cover just if you're in a facility, or will it also cover in home care and like other options?
It depends on the type of policy. Most policies will have a definition around facility based care versus home care. Some policies will discount home care. They'll simply say, like, hey, home care is cheaper, so you don't get quite as much of a benefit if it's home care versus facility care. But that just comes down to definitions. I typically see kind of a universal definition applied to all forms of care, but a way to discount or reduce the cost of the premiums is to provide a different definition for home care. A big question that can arise there is whether the home care provider needs to be qualified, i.e., a licensed, certified, nursing assistant or somebody like that working for an agency, or whether it can be a family member. That's a definitional element that'll affect both the cost of the policy and then naturally the potential payout of the policy. But that's certainly something to pay close attention to as you shop policies. It's not something where you're looking at it purely based on sticker price. You really need to ask the question of, what does this policy actually pay for? How much does it pay? What does it pay for? When? And so on.
Right. So it really is a very individualized thing you need to research for you and your family.
Absolutely. And this is something that, I do think a good insurance agent can certainly earn their money on. There's not a lot of long-term care insurance companies in the marketplace anymore. As I mentioned earlier, it's gotten very expensive to get policies. It's very difficult to qualify for, and it's because insurance companies have struggled to make money off of long-term care policies. Turns out the equilibrium between how much they can charge in premiums that's affordable and how much the premiums have to pay for in terms of claims is a very difficult balance to walk. But I do think working with an agent who has a lot of long-term care experience can help you in this. There's a designation, certified long-term care, I believe, counselor, CLTC, can also help you identify people who have more of a specialization in this area. But I do think it's very helpful to shop it, to look at it. And again, you want to get this a lot earlier than you think you should. I think people kind of between 50 and 60 are in the golden spot of not getting it too early, but not waiting so long that they can't qualify for it. What I do see is a lot of people get all the way to retirement, 65 plus, who then say, oh, I want to get a long-term care policy. And surprise, surprise, they're already ineligible because at this point, one or two little health issues have kicked in. Maybe they've had a knee replacement, hip replacement. Maybe they're taking a medication that suggests that they're going to have mobility challenges, and so then they have a very hard time qualifying for it, and they have to look at things like long-term care, riders on life insurance policies, or asset-based policies in lieu of traditional long-term care, which typically speaking is going to be your best form of protection for a long-term care need.
So it doesn't take much to disqualify for long term care.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give a very specific example. I know an individual who to this day is still working, is very healthy, active, and so on. Uh, and they applied almost a decade ago, at the same time that they were essentially like residing their house and repainting their house and redoing the roof themselves and so on, fully physically active. They were disqualified simply because they'd had a medical retirement from a high intensity law enforcement job, where they weren't qualified to get in fist fights and roll around on the ground and risk their risk their lives and their health in that way anymore. But they were still perfectly functional, but they were declined for long-term care. The interesting thing around long-term care policies is the underwriting criteria is typically more difficult, but it is sort of inverse to something like life insurance. In life insurance policies, we're worried about things like diabetes, heart disease, cancer, because they're likely to kill us off. Long-term care is not so concerned with those because if you die, they don't have to pay necessarily, or they have to pay less. But in turn, they're very concerned with quality of life elements. How is your cognitive capability? How is your physical mobility? And do you have any chronic conditions that will lead to challenges with your ability to take care of yourself at a certain point?
So they look at family history too for like Alzheimer's and things like that.
Yep, that's going to be a huge flag. Doesn't mean you're automatically not going to be disqualified, but that may lead to a much lower rating, which then, of course, increases your premium cost quite dramatically. And even somebody with a high quality rating for long term care is looking at thousands of dollars a year for even a basic policy.
Hmm. There's a lot of things to plan for. All right.
Well, there's nothing like the unforeseen and unexpected to really mess with your financial plans. So when we think about something like long-term care, you need to plan for your own care, your own potential incapacity, and again, as the filial responsibility conversation goes, you need to look at your family members and say, okay, real talk, who might need some help at some point, either financially, personally, or even just with their activities of daily living. All right. Well, Emily, it's been a couple weeks since you've been on the show. So let me ask, what is the most interesting or useful thing you've learned in the past few weeks?
Interesting. I don't know if I've learned a lot of overly interesting things. It's been a lot of studying regulations and things like that still for me. Although what's really been impressed upon me is just that there's always so much more to learn in every little way. Even something as little as a conversation we had yesterday with a colleague about how incredibly expensive certain people's hobbies can be that I wasn't aware of that they definitely plan around. They have an annual budget that I would not have considered for that. And I just feel like it's a lot more important than I realized before to ask people a lot of specific personal questions about their life because everybody's plan is super personalized, or it should be.
The Science of Wealth is produced by My Wealth Planners, a registered investment advisor in Colorado. The theme song is This Is Your Time by Dan Phillips. The podcast is intended for educational purposes only and is not investment advice or any other form of advice. Not all material discussed on the podcast is appropriate for every individual in every circumstance, so you should consult with a certified financial planner, tax professional, or legal professional as appropriate before attempting to apply any of the subjects, strategies, or tactics discussed on the podcast.